Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is July 29th, which means we're almost done with another month. We almost made it, almost to August. And today's episode, you'll be happy to know that I finally made it to new movies. Yes, nobody thought I could do it. But we're brand new for this episode, and this episode is focused on biopics. So the first one is Radioactive, detailing the life of Marie Curie on Amazon Prime, released this past Friday. So then I also decided to watch Frida as my weekly watch, which was back in 2002-2003. Obviously detailing the life of Frida Kahlo. And finally, my weekly recommendation is Jackie, detailing the life of Jackie Kennedy. So, I'm sure you can sense a theme. Important historical women is the theme for today. I'm very excited to get into it. And then the final segment is going to be a little bit different than the actual theme. I'm hoping that either the end of each month or the beginning of the next month to talk about some of the movie news over the past 31 days. So I did that about a month ago. And so I'm going to do that again this episode. And this episode is going to be even more focused because we just got done with Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, which unfortunately, obviously due to COVID, had to be online. So there's not nearly as much movie news, but there always is some movie news coming out of that. So I'm going to focus on that and then also add some other stuff from this past month that is relevant in movie news. So that's today's episode, and let's get right into it. Alright, so Radioactive was released this past Friday on Amazon Prime. It details the life and times of Marie Curie, the famous Polish scientist who discovered radioactivity as well as two other elements in France along with her husband Pierre Curie. And so that's kind of what the whole movie's about. It's about her entire life, focusing somewhat on the radioactivity aspect, but really just about her. And so this is going to be a very interesting episode, and I'll say why, because I'm not the biggest fan of biopics. I think that biopics tend to take somebody's entire life, usually a life that's very dense with a lot of things going on, and condense it into an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe even a little bit more. And lives don't really follow a conventional narrative, so not only is everything oversimplified because of how short it is, but it's also forced to fit into this film narrative, or just like any kind of narrative, in general. And so it kind of doesn't work for me most of the time. I would much prefer when movies focus on like a specific aspect of somebody's life as opposed to an entire life. And so that's something that this movie does not do. It does the whole life thing. So right off the bat, I'm going to say that I was not a very big fan of Radioactive. I didn't really have any expectations going in. I didn't have any assumptions because I did not know much about Marie Curie. That's actually a running theme throughout this entire episode. I didn't know a lot about any of these women, which is always a nice thing to have going into like a blind eye to see, all right, we get to see that not only this movie as a movie, but also an educational tool to see who this person really is. And it kind of fails at both of those things for me. So let's talk about it. First of all, there is way too much happening in this movie. So like I said, with most biopics that try and detail somebody's entire life, this one does that, and there's so much happening in her life that we don't get more than a couple minutes to really sit with any major event. We also don't get no more than like a couple minutes to sit with any character for that much time. It's just everything is packed in to this hour and 45 minutes. And one of the things that I think biopics assume of most viewers is that they do know something about this character that they're portraying, because like, let's say you know something about Marie Curie, you're a science person, you're a history person, maybe a STEM person already connected with Marie Curie as sort of a character, because obviously we don't know these people as people, so we kind of can only treat them as characters, but you're already connected, you're already emotionally invested. If that's the case, you might really enjoy this movie, because there's not a lot of character development, or at least character building initially that then would translate to development later on. We just don't get enough time really in any specific aspect of Marie Curie's life to actually understand her character, other than a few maybe acting choices that Rosamund Pike had done. And so if you're already connected with her as a character, you may actually enjoy this movie quite a bit. I do think there are other aspects of this movie that I don't think are very good, not just the screenplay or the character, but for somebody that was not all that familiar with Marie Curie, other than, say, the major stuff, the big important things, you don't get any chance to be emotionally invested in the character. So it assumes that you know all of these things. And there's also weird moments in the screenplay that draw parallels between different things that if you don't know the historical context around them or don't know what's going on, you're going to be either very confused or draw conclusions that the screenplay probably doesn't want you to draw, that don't actually make any sense. So in the film, not only does it focus on Marie Curie, there are moments in the screenplay where they move to other later historical events that have to do with radioactivity and what this discovery did for the world, whether positive or negative, which I think is a really cool idea. I would have liked that to be explored even more. But the film is being a little bit conceptual when doing this, because it's just straying from the narrative at hand. So by nature, it's already being somewhat conceptual from it. And so there's a specific moment where they talk about the attack of Hiroshima from World War II, and at the same time, Pierre Curie is talking about the effects of radioactivity, or just like the discovery at hand for the Nobel Prize. He's giving a speech. And cross-cutting these two things, if you don't know that we're talking about Hiroshima, implies that Pierre Curie is about to get bombed. Like, it kind of draws this parallel, cutting between two things, is that they're supposed to be connected from a narrative standpoint. So it kind of implies that there's about to be this big attack in Sweden, and if you don't know the context either from Pierre Curie's life or from World War II, you're gonna be drawing this parallel just from the language of film. So that's why I think that this film kind of assumes too much of its audience. Just kind of throughout the entire thing, from either the life of Marie Curie or just the other things that are going on. That being said, I like what this film is trying to do. It seems pretty clear that the film wants to be a lot more conceptual than it actually is. So there are moments of large visual effects, weird cross-cutting between the historical events. There are just a lot of different things that wouldn't be happening in just sort of a mainstream sort of run-of-the-mill mass appeal movie. But it does this while still trying to fit into the conventional narrative of a biopic and just a mass appeal movie. So it's kind of trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's like trying to do two things at once. And I would have really liked if this film had gone a lot more conceptual. So it's trying to kind of fit into the biopic narrative, but if it had almost abandoned the traditional way of telling this story, which it does for most of the film, and focused on the really odd aspects of the filmmaking and just kind of gone all out with the weird, and make it a much more conceptual biopic talking about Marie Curie and radioactivity, as opposed to like the life of radioactivity, it would have been much more interesting to draw the parallels between Marie Curie's life and the discovery of radioactivity. So from like a thematic standpoint, as opposed to an actual narrative standpoint, and therefore we could have gotten some of the moments of the actual discovery and some of the life of Marie Curie. But if we focused on just her person as well as the discovery of radioactivity, and draw those themes together through the weirdness and conceptual moments that the film is already trying to do, I think that would have been a lot more interesting and made for just a much better film, as opposed to fitting everything in all at once and making a movie that is doing too much and not enough at the same time. Also, the film starts with a flash forward. Almost all biopics start from the end, which is sort of like cliche. It's like we know that either the person is dead or we know that they're accomplished by the end of their life. We don't need to see how they get there because we know we're going to. That's the movie we signed up for. So I just think it's a little bit unnecessary. And kind of right from the get-go, like right from the start of the movie, I was like, oh, okay, this is the biopic that we're in for. But moving on to the acting, the acting isn't bad. It's solid. I think that there's not a lot given to these characters in the screenplay because it seems as though the screenplay is assuming the audience knows who these characters are. There's not a lot from the actual script where we get to really understand who these characters are. So I think Rosamund Pike made some really interesting choices with characterizing Marie Curie, where you actually get a sense of who she might be. So we don't really get that from the screenplay and getting to sit with these characters throughout certain moments because it just moves so quickly through different historical events. So the choices that Rosamund Pike makes, I would say she's the standout, which is obviously a good thing when it's your main character in the biopic that it's focused on. The rest of the acting is pretty solid, pretty serviceable. Nothing to like rave about, but it's definitely pretty solid. The weirdest choice is the fact that they all kind of have British accents, which Marie Curie is Polish, moving to France, to Paris. Pierre Curie is French, and it's in English, so sure. This is a film made for the United States primarily. But there's no reason for them to be having British accents other than to have sound a little bit more I guess astute. It would have been just as easy to have them have French accents. So it just seems a little bit odd to me. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they both had British accents. Please let me know. Correct me if I'm wrong. But that just seemed like a choice that's to make them just sound smarter that doesn't actually have any bearing and is actually completely different from where they're actually from. As far as the production design goes, most of the things in this movie, unless I say some of the downsides of them, are pretty solid. There's nothing that stands out as being a huge negative. So that goes to the production design. A period piece like this is going to have lavish costumes and is going to be period accurate. As far as I can tell, it's period accurate. I'm not a historian. I'm not a clothing historian, so I don't actually know. It looks as though it fits. And it also looks really good. It fits with the characters. I also think that the portrayal of radium, the element that she discovers, is pretty solid, at least from the film. Again, I don't know if that's actually what it looks like. Maybe there's some creative liberties being taken, but I really like the neon glow. I think that looks really great for the film, and I wish that they had almost played that up even more. The makeup here is also pretty good. There's a pretty seamless transition for Rosamund Pike from young Marie Curie to old Marie Curie. She honestly, a lot of time, old makeup looks pretty corny, or you can tell. But I actually think that the evolution for Rosamund Pike in this looks pretty solid. There's nothing that if I didn't know who Rosamund Pike was and I would assume that she was 60 when she has that makeup on. So that looks really good. Going back to kind of the radium, that translates to some of the cinematography. There's some interesting colored lighting going on. Most of it has to do with the neon green. I would have liked that to be even more, because a lot of the lighting here is pretty dark for most of the film. It's pretty brown, black. And so it just looks a little bit dull. I would have liked, this kind of goes with my thought that I want it to be more conceptual to begin with. So having it be neon green for a lot of it would have been really cool. That definitely happens, but it only happens when they're looking at radium, or there's sort of a dream sequence maybe. So I would have liked that to emulate throughout more of the film. The other weirdest thing to me about this movie is that every shot has this weird haze over it. It looks very like angelic and glowy for no reason. It's almost kind of distracting at certain points. There, like, legitimately, I can't find a single narrative reason for that to be the case other than like to give it the sense that it's a little bit older. This is a technique that was used in a lot of older films from like the 30s and the 40s. But this is not a film that's about film, so it just seemed like another way to make it look better than it actually is, in the same way that the British accents might have been there to do that. So I wasn't really a big fan of the haze glow going on there. Also in this film, there's a lot of visual effects, and I actually like a lot of the moments where there's sort of like cartoony visual effects. There's a specific moment where she talks about like how atoms work, and I actually kind of like that. For one, I didn't really talk about this during the screenplay, but it doesn't teach you anything about radioactivity. It just assumes that you either know it. The whole like atom thing, if you don't know much about science, which is somebody like I don't know much about science, it will completely go over your head. And the things that she does explain, or the movie tries to explain, I just don't think are that important, and then it just doesn't really do much for radioactivity. I would have wanted to learn more about that as well as wanting to learn more about Marie Curie, so we not only don't know much about her as a character, we also don't know much about radioactivity. So like, they talk about how it has all these negative effects. They don't say why. They don't say what they are. It also flash forwards to a moment where it's being used for cancer treatment, and up to this point, you're only aware that radioactivity can do bad things. So when they talk about it as a cancer treatment, you assume it's going to go really poorly, unless, of course, you know, like the way radioactivity is used in modern technology, which, again, something that I kind of knew about, but not particularly, so I just think it assumes too much, but that's a little more of a tangent that I probably should have said earlier. But so the moments where these like visual effects are happening are pretty good. I kind of like them. They look a little bit more cartoony. I think that probably has to do with the budget. But I like it. I would have wanted even more of that. The thing about the visual effects, though, that stood out to me is if you some of you may already know this, but a lot of backdrops now are CGI. They're visual effects. So like a cityscape or a car chase is usually going to be CGI, just because it's easier. A lot of computers know how to do those backdrops much easier than to like animate people or animate motion, or just animate like human motion, human interaction. So it's also much cheaper to do that than to rent out an entire set, create an entire studio, do an entire car chase. So a lot of times those backdrops are animated. And this was one of the only films recently that I could actually notice it. So there's a lot of backdrops in the city that I think just like not enough time was taken to fully animate these. The lighting probably had a lot to do with it because it was really dark, so it ended up looking just like it blended in with the background with the night. It also might have had to do with the budget. So I don't know what happened there. I just think that was much more noticeable than it is in a lot of other films, and kind of just reflected the overall quality of the film. Moving on to the editing, this film is at a breakneck pace. The first like hour and 15 minutes of this movie, you don't sit with a scene for longer than maybe 5 minutes at a time. And even those like 5-6 minute scenes are like very few and far between. Every scene is extremely short and really only exists to move the narrative forward. It doesn't actually move any like character moments forward. We don't get to understand these characters. I've said that kind of throughout this entire thing, but the editing really translates to that. So I don't know if that was something that was highlighted in the screenplay, that all these scenes are really short, or if that's just something that happened kind of on the cutting room floor or the shooting. But really, you just don't get any time to sit with these characters, and you're moving so quickly just to fit everything in about Marie Curie's life until like 30 minutes left. Then it goes extremely slowly for some reason, and that tends to be when it's like much more like not much is happening. It's like post discovery. It's post a lot of the moments with her husband Pierre. It kind of moves into her as a mother, but that's also not really focused on all that much. Somewhat her as a teacher, but we get like 1 or 2 scenes of that. It's really just to see her. Like, I hate to say this, but it's just kind of watching her mope around for a lot of it. And doesn't do much for her characterization. It doesn't do much for our sympathy of the character, and it just doesn't do much for the film at large, because you are sitting with this movie that is so fast-paced, and it's only an hour 45, but it feels like 3 hours by the time you get to that 30-minute mark, or by the time you get to the 30-minute left mark. The other thing, too, with the wanting it to be more conceptual is there are some moments, particularly a dream sequence, that shows that it wants to be a lot more conceptual, like I had said, but it doesn't actually do anything with a lot of the visuals. It'll have, like, creative lighting, sure, but it's really just a lot of things that we've already seen cut really quickly. So because it's cut really quickly and sporadically, it almost gives the illusion that it's much more conceptual and much stranger, much more surreal than it actually is. So a lot of those like surreal aspects happen because of the amount of cuts there are and not because of what we're actually being shown. Getting to the sound, the score starts out with like an acoustic sounding score. It starts with, I think it starts with like a guitar, and then there's one track with, or no, it's more symphonic. It's like strings, and then it gets to a track that's more piano based, and then it starts to get really techno, like just like really electronic. So there doesn't seem to be much like seamless transition between what the score sounds like. It seems to be a little bit all over the place, not really much of a semblance. And then when it gets to the much more techno aspect of it, it's not a bad score. It's pretty good. But it just sort of feels a bit uninspired to me because it's like, oh, science, electronic, techno, like it kind of is a really easy parallel to draw to be like, this is the kind of score we're going to make. And it doesn't really fit a lot of the narrative aspects of it because of the time period that it takes place in. If it was much more conceptual like that, I think it would have worked a lot better. But then also just the electronic choices that are used, the synthesizers that are used are just pretty generic for film scores. There just doesn't really seem to be much originality there. There also tends to be music underlying almost every scene, which is a big pet peeve of mine because we don't get any time to sit with these characters without the influence of a score. And then it also tends to build tension in scenes that don't need to build tension. So it seems as though like most times a lot of times scores are building up to something, and you can tell by the what you're hearing or trying to elicit this certain emotion that might not be happening on screen yet. And so it's doing that with scenes that don't feel necessary to do that. It's almost just to fill dead space, which I would have much preferred there be dead space because there's not a lot of that in the beginning of the film. And so that's most of this film. I want to say that it's directed by a woman named Marjane Satrapi, who is a pretty like well-known indie director. She had done a movie called Persepolis, which is one that we study a lot in film school, that is very original. Another one called The Voices, which is also very original, not nearly as critically acclaimed, but still very original. And so I really like to think that a lot of what's going on here is just because of a lot of either producer interference or studio interference, which I can't say that because I don't know that definitively. Not a lot of information has come out about this film because it's brand new. But it definitely feels that way because it feels like there's too much going on and it's a little bit unfocused. And because the director is so creative and original and unique, it seems like a lot of those conceptual moments is something that she might have been pushing, that she wanted to do, and I would have wanted to see a lot more of that. It also really feels like this film was made to be like a mini series for Amazon maybe, and was cut down because every scene is cut down, and I think it would have worked really well as a mini series. So either keep it how it is, make it a mini series and make it like 6 episodes so we can actually see everything that's going on and really understand these historical moments, these historical characters, or make it super conceptual and focus mostly on the themes as opposed to the actual narrative, and compare those two things. But that is my general thought on this film. Overall, I think it's not nearly as focused as it should be. Too much is going on, and I really would have wanted this movie to be a lot stronger than it actually was. So I'm going to give this film a solid to strong 3 out of 10. There are still some things going on that I do like, or some things that are ultimately just serviceable, but overall would have wanted it to be a lot different of a movie than it actually was. So that's Radioactive. If you're interested in Marie Curie as a character, already into that kind of thing, check it out on Amazon Prime. Otherwise, I would skip this one, and we're going to continue this episode by talking about some other biopics about some historical women. And so the first one, or the next one that I'm going to be talking about, is Frida. And then I'll finally give you my weekly recommendation, which is Jackie. And then at the very end of the episode, stay tuned because I'm going to be talking about some of the biggest movie news from the past month. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of Radioactive, the newest film from Amazon Prime. I will now be talking about Frida, a film from 2002. Then I'll be talking about my weekly recommendation, which is Jackie. And finally, stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about some of the most recent movie news from this past month. So right now, this is my weekly watch. I chose this because I wanted to watch another biopic that was about a historically important woman who I also didn't know much about. This one is available right now on Netflix, and so I was very curious to watch it. It details, so it stars Salma Hayek. It is directed by Julie Taymor. It details the life of Frida Kahlo, who is a revolutionary painter from Mexico. So I didn't know much about this movie going in. I actually didn't know anything about this movie. I didn't even really know that it existed. I also don't know much about the character of Frida Kahlo. I kind of knew, again, much of the important stuff, but I didn't know really anything going into this. So I was very excited to see it. And overall, I ultimately enjoyed this movie. Again, with most biopics, this tends to be the case. I'm not the biggest fan of how they're usually laid out. This one is no exception. This one does kind of fit that same mold of trying to detail the entire life, which I would have preferred that this one go another different route, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But this one I think is a lot more interesting. We actually get a lot more time to understand Frida Kahlo as a character. It's much more focused on her. So where Radioactive was trying to say a lot about Marie Curie and radioactivity and also kind of Pierre Curie, this one is really solely focused on Frida Kahlo and somewhat of her husband, Diego Rivera, who is also another famous Mexican painter from the early 20th century, but mostly it focuses on Frida Kahlo and her own life experience. And yeah, so let's talk about the movie itself. Because it's trying to get all of these big life events from Frida Kahlo's life into 1 2-hour film, this film also moves very quickly. A lot of the really big moments, I think, get a little more time to breathe than some of the others, but there are some that move really quickly. So, for example, the beginning of the film, she gets into an almost fatal bus accident where she sustains a very large injury to her back, to her spine, so the doctors don't even know if she'll be able to walk again. That's where she starts to begin painting. And going from injured, almost dead, not being able to walk is like 10 minutes. Like, we don't actually get much time to understand her psyche going through that, other than a couple brief moments of just her alone, which I like that a lot better. I like that we have a lot of silent moments here and a lot of moments just to be experiencing her in her most vulnerable moments, and a lot of it doesn't seem to be. It was probably detailed in the screenplay, but it's silent moments, and so it's moments that I think were focused more with the directing and the cinematography. So I really like that that's going on here. We actually get to sympathize with Frida Kahlo a lot more than some other biopics, I would say, because we're more focused on her as a character as opposed to the actual narrative of her life. So there is that, which I really like. And there are a few moments that I think are really big, but those are the moments that I would have liked the movie to talk about more and almost would have preferred the movie just to be about. So, for example, she goes to New York City with her husband, Diego Rivera, who is commissioned to do a painting for Rockefeller, who's played by Ed Norton, which was a surprise cameo. I know that was kind of fun. But I would have almost preferred an entire movie about their trip to New York, or because then we get to understand like her relationship with her husband, her relationship with some of the other people that she might have been with, both their relationships as painters and revolutionaries, because a lot of this takes place during the Mexican Revolution, which is something that I also don't know much about, and is not really detailed much in this film overall. It kind of assumes that you know what's going on already. So I would have liked either a movie to be just about that. There's also scenes towards the end where Trotsky takes asylum with her and Rivera. I think a really interesting movie would have been just the three of them, as well as Trotsky's wife, kind of all cooped up in a house for like 2 weeks. They don't actually say the actual time frame in the film, but I think that would have been a really interesting film to understand who these people are, their ideas, why they're so famous. And I think a lot of the point that this film is trying to get across, I think would have been able to get across in a movie like that. So that's just personal preference. But since that isn't the movie and it's mainly talking, or it's talking about just her life as a whole, there are some really interesting moments. I think there's a lot of poignant lines. I think the actual dialogue here is really, really quite tight. There's some lines that I think are supposed to sting, in ways that not only does it sting characters in the film, but it also stings the audience and are very poignant. I also just really like the agency that Frida Kahlo has in this story, and just the realism that she has as a person. So there's a scene in the beginning of the film where she talks about painting, and she says, "Can I get money for painting?" And Diego Rivera tells her, "You don't paint because you want to make money, you paint because you can't do anything else." And she says, "No, I have to make money. If I can't paint and I can't make money off of it, tell me and I'll do something else." And so I think that's a really interesting aspect of her character that I really liked that was kind of explored. And it really makes sense. The evolution of her character then makes sense through the lens of her injury, her perception of the relationships that she has, her perception like as a woman in this society. So I just really liked a lot of that, and a lot of that is not only shown through her character, but also through some of the specific lines, which I really, really liked. So then moving on to the acting, all of the acting in here is really, really solid. Salma Hayek is fantastic as Frida Kahlo. So there's a lot of different emotional beats that happen with Salma Hayek's character. So she goes kind of through an evolution of really like free-spirited, loving life, and kind of crazy to a certain extent, and just very over the top. And then the injury happens and she becomes much quieter, and then she goes through that evolution again. So she goes from being really quiet to then kind of moving towards the free-spirited, to then it keeps going up and down between like free-spirited, broken, free-spirited, broken, and the evolution to build up to one, or the downfall of another one. Salma Hayek just does a great job showing that evolution, so none of it feels out of place. So there's a couple moments where it feels like there's these really rash moments that in another film or with another actor might feel unjustified, that we don't actually understand why she might be doing something like that, but here we understand, because some of just the subtle facial expressions that she has, some of the previous scenes where we get to see her reaction to things. So these scenes where she might have a big outburst actually feel very justified because we really understand her character. So I think that's a credit to both the directing and a credit to Salma Hayek. I think she does a fantastic job. I think Alfred Molina also does a very great job as Diego Rivera. They're two very different characters. I think there's not nearly as sort of highs and lows that Diego Rivera has to go through in this film and has to portray, but I do like the sense that we kind of always feel as though he's lying or saying something that he doesn't actually believe, even though he does have these very strong beliefs. What we see from a interpersonal relationship with him, he doesn't seem to tell the truth very often, and I actually think that is transparent through Molina's portrayal of Diego Rivera, which I thought was really nice. This might have to do more with the screenplay, but I think the relationship between Frida and Diego should have been characterized a little bit different. I think that probably has to do with modern sensibilities and some of the details that aren't really explained as well. So it seems as though Frida Kahlo is much younger than Diego Rivera at the time that they begin their relationship, apprenticeship, then that moves to a more romantic sexual relationship. And so it's framed as somewhat romantic, and then towards the end of the film, much more romantic. And I don't think that would hold up to today's standards. So maybe that should have been characterized a little bit different, but it was both a different time that the film was being made and, of course, that the relationship took place. So that might be sort of like modern sensibilities being put onto it, but I think that should have been characterized in a way that was a little bit less sympathetic rose-colored glasses, and maybe characterize more how it is in the middle of the movie where things are going through that turmoil. But moving on to the production design, this is definitely my favorite aspect of the film. A lot of the mise-en-scène is supposed to reflect the paintings of Frida Kahlo and somewhat of the paintings of Diego Rivera, but obviously mainly focused on Frida. So I really like that a lot of the colors here are desaturated in the same way that her paints are. And so there are also specific frames that are intentionally the exact same as paintings. And so I think all of those look beautiful, and I think that this film has a very distinct look, because of the fact that it's desaturated in that way. A lot of times there tend to be a more, distinct color palette for the types of colors that are being used. In this one, kind of every color of the rainbow is there. It's just in that much more, natural earthy tones, which I really, really like here, and is pretty distinct from other movies. Is another period piece, so the costumes are obviously going to be much more lavish, and so here they very much are. They're really gorgeous, and a lot of the costumes that Frida Kahlo wears look fantastic, and so I just think the costume department did a really great job, both historically and aesthetically. So that's the production design. Moving on to the cinematography, like I said, a lot of things are trying to be framed like the paintings. There's also, this kind of ties into the editing, but there are specific moments where there is sort of a painting that then transitions to the moment that the painting is supposed to portray, and that feels almost seamless. I almost had to go back at one point to actually see if it was a painting at first, and so that looks gorgeous. So that's editing, and it's also a lot of the framing. So the framing and the cinematography is fantastic here. I also think that there are some really creative moments in this film that don't feel nearly as out of place as they do in Radioactive, because this film is so focused on Frida as a character that a lot of these surreal moments, whether it be a little bit of animation or puppetry or montage, whatnot, feels like a reflection of her psyche. And so there's a moment of kind of animation, but it's sort of these Day of the Dead-esque skeleton dolls that look really great and kind of caught me off guard at first. It was really unexpected, and I really, really liked it. Those also don't really feel out of place because the editing flows pretty well. So it is really quickly paced because of the fact that we're trying to fit so many things in, but there actually tends to be a lot longer scenes, and so whether it be a scene that's mainly focused on character or on narrative, it's not like we have this overabundance of scenes, so we don't actually get to sit with any of these characters. Here we actually do, and we actually get to breathe and understand these characters a lot deeper because the scenes are a lot longer. It also doesn't rely too heavily on montage, which I really liked. So a lot of biopics in particular, but just films in general, rely on montage to move the story forward in a quick way. I think there's maybe one or two here, particularly in New York City. But overall, it really doesn't rely too heavily on montage, which I think was makes it stand out in a way that's a lot different from other biopics, and I really appreciated. The score here is a traditional Mexican folk music, and it fits really well. I think that a lot of times types of music tend to be pigeonholed in, other than maybe like an orchestra, tend to be pigeonholed into one specific emotion that's being portrayed here. I like that we actually get to see the nuance of this type of music and see it in an emotional scene as well as a much higher energy scene. So I really like it. It makes the movie really cohesive because it's the same type of score throughout. It also feels very traditional, very respectful for the source material, and so I thought that was a really great aspect of the film. As far as the directing goes, I think Julie Taymor does a really great job framing all of these characters in a really sympathetic light. She has a strong focus on framing in this movie, on mise-en-scène, and so the camera, the editing, the production design all play into that. So she really focuses on Frida as a character, and everything in the film is sort of reflective of her psyche. So it is objectively told, but because we are so in tune with Frida Kahlo's psyche throughout this film, we can actually see how that is reflected through the rest of the film. So I really enjoyed a lot of the aspects of this film. I think I rave in this review about some of the technical aspects a lot, but that doesn't necessarily translate to my actual rating because of the fact that it still is a biopic that follows that narrative of way too much is happening. Really would have wished it was something else to translate the themes, ideas, and lives of these characters, and specifically, obviously, Frida Kahlo. So I thought it was very educational and also very well told, very well portrayed through a lot of these technical aspects, but overall I would give this film a soft to solid 7. So kind of right in the middle of the line of good films. I used to give films like 7s all the time. It was either like 4 stars or 7 out of 10. But so I try not to do that as much anymore because I always feel like it kind of falls in just sort of like middle of the pack. But this one definitely fits that. So I would recommend this film if you're interested in the source material. If you're interested in seeing a biopic in general, I think this one is pretty darn good for biopics as a whole. So I can say that I would recommend this one if you're into that kind of thing. It's streaming right now on Netflix. But right now I'm going to go into my weekly recommendation, which is a biopic that I really, really enjoy called Jackie, about Jackie Kennedy. And then stay tuned until the last segment where I talk about some of the movie news from the past month. But right now we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in, I have given my reviews of Radioactive, Frida, and I will now be talking about my weekly recommendation, which is Jackie, and then I will talk about some of the most recent movie news from the past month. So right now is Jackie, which is by far my favorite biopic, because it doesn't follow that same narrative that I talked about earlier in some of those other films. It's from 2016. I saw this one. Maybe I'm a little bit biased. I saw this one on my birthday with some of my friends, so it has some good memories attached to it, but I also just think it's a very well done film, and I watched it again recently, and so on a rewatch, it's just as good, if not better. So let's talk about the movie. Let's talk about what I'm supposed to be talking about. So Jackie is obviously about Jackie Kennedy, and it specifically focuses on an interview that she had with a journalist a couple months post the assassination of JFK, and it's the first public appearance. I mean, it's a literary appearance, but first public outing since that event, and so it follows the actual conversation, which we don't have access to, so it's much more of an imagined conversation, but it's about the conversation as well as flashbacks to the event, and to moments of her life as First Lady. And so one of the reasons I really like this film is because it's not really trying to do the same thing a lot of other biopics are doing, where it's detailing the entire life of Jackie Kennedy. It really only focuses on the political campaigns of JFK and her relationship to that, her relationship with her husband and the public. And so really it starts from – obviously it starts during this conversation with the journalist, which I think is a really fascinating way to frame it. But it really – as far as like a narrative linear point of view, it kind of starts from when John F. Kennedy was a senator, and so early on in his political career. So it's not just the presidency, but it is mostly the presidency. So it really is focused on really only a couple years of her life, and specifically her relationship to a lot of other people around her, particularly John F. Kennedy, of course, and also just her public perception with the United States. So I think that's just a really fascinating way that this movie's told. It's really focused on one aspect of her life that then translates to the character that she actually is, and then it also is framed in a really creative way because we're not seeing the flashbacks in a linear perspective. We're seeing them as she's telling them or as they reflect to what she's talking about. So I really like that. The flashbacks are also a really great way of framing this conversation because the emotions that she may be feeling during the conversation then translate to events in her life. And so having that go back and forth and comparing how she's feeling now with a lot of the grief that she has to kind of sit with a lot of the events that we don't know the context to right away, but then are learning the context to throughout the film, I think is really great. It doesn't assume too much of the viewer. So for somebody that wasn't alive back then, for somebody that really only knows kind of about, again, the big stuff, the assassination, and really not much about Jackie at all, it doesn't really assume that you're supposed to know any of these things. And so I really like that it assumes that the viewer doesn't know everything and is really telling you along with the film. The dialogue here is really wonderful because we get both moments of her in private and in public. Having the dialogue that she says to specific people, we can understand the character that she is. So the journalist that she's speaking to is technically in private, but obviously it's something that he's going to be writing about and publishing nationwide, potentially even worldwide. And so she has to have a filter up for sure. She has to have she's shielding a lot of the things that she's trying to say. And so then comparing that to the moments where she's speaking with her husband or other people that work in the work sort of in the White House, you can see what she's trying to hide, or at least just kind of mask in some way to the public, and also what she's trying to mask kind of to the relationships that she has, and comparing those two things. So I think that's really fascinating. Code switching is something that I find really fascinating, and that's something that everybody does. And so in here, evaluating it from a public sense and then a personal sense, I think is very, very fascinating to look at. The only thing about the screenplay that I am not necessarily a big fan of, it didn't bother me nearly as much on a second watch, but I remember the first time watching it, this film feels as though it ends a couple times. There are scenes that feel somewhat conclusive with the score and the framing, that then another scene happens. I think that happens about 2 or 3 times. So didn't bother me as much on the second watch because I already knew that it was happening. And it already is a pretty short film, so it doesn't need to lose any time to cut any of those out. But because they feel so conclusive, it gets a little bit monotonous towards the end, and I would have wanted a stronger choice for which one to end on, as opposed to kind of doing a couple different things. But that's really the only downside, I feel. Moving on to the acting, Natalie Portman knocks it out of the park with this. It's really insane to watch the side by side between different things. So there's the Kennedys were the first politicians or president to kind of give a tour of the White House, and that's what Jackie Kennedy does. And so they compare, or you compare if you go home and watch it, the actual broadcast of it versus Natalie Portman's portrayal of it is uncanny. And it's really great because it's not really an impersonation. It's not like she's trying to do an impression. She's really just trying to emulate Jackie Kennedy, so she's got that accent down. And then she also has just a lot of the nuances of the body movement. So it seems as though she just understands Jackie Kennedy as a character really well, and that she wasn't trying to mimic everything that was happening. Not only, I mean, I'm speaking on that White House broadcast because of the fact that it's one of the only things you can really compare it to. But she's not trying to mimic it. You can see when you compare it side by side that it's not exactly the same. It's obviously the blocking is the same, but some of the inflections aren't the same. Some of the specific movements that she has, maybe with her hands, with her face, aren't specifically the same. But because she's got that character so well ingrained in her, it feels as though she is Jackie Kennedy, and she's not just doing sort of this one-note impersonation of her, which is really fantastic and really just a credit to Natalie Portman and the directing. There's also a phenomenal emotional range that she goes throughout this film. So there's really high highs, really low lows, obviously with the events that happen in this film. And all of those feel believable. None of them feel out of place. Because of the fact that we're cutting on different emotions through the conversation with the journalist and then also through the flashbacks, those kind of differences in emotions and performance are narratively justified, and then because the acting is so strong, it is also justified through the character that she's portraying. There's also just some really great performances from everybody throughout this film. John Hurt plays a priest in this film, and he does a really great job, a really sympathetic performance. Greta Gerwig is also in this, playing Nancy Tuckerman, who does a lot of consoling for Jackie Kennedy, and she's fantastic. I just love Greta Gerwig. She's really great in this film. Peter Skarsgård plays Bobby Kennedy. Billy Crudup? I really am bad at that. Plays the journalist. He does a really great job. John Carroll Lynch plays Lyndon B. Johnson. So everybody really just kind of nails these performances because they all just feel very sympathetic. And everything feels very justified. Also, the guy that plays JFK, Casper Phillipson, looks exactly like JFK in this film. It's really eerie. But all of the performances are just so strong because they're not trying to do impressions of these characters. It seems as though they've just really done their research and really understand who these characters are, because we're seeing moments that we wouldn't have seen on actual broadcasts and can't compare it to things. There has to be some sort of playful imagination with the actors to really encapsulate these characters, and they really just do a fantastic job that feels justified in almost every aspect of their performance. The production design perfectly captures the look and feel of this era of the White House, of these figures, because we actually have some photos to compare it to. The actual costumes of Jackie Kennedy look identical to the ones that she wears, which is something that, if that hadn't been done, it would have been like, why didn't you do that? That was really easy. So the fact that it looks fantastic, both on screen and also compared to the real life clothing that Jackie Kennedy wore, is really great. The costume department did a really fantastic job on this. I also really like how much more crowded the flashbacks feel to the conversation with the journalist in the later moments of the film, because the moments with the journalist that take place in her sort of secluded home feel much more open, feel much more spacious. It feels like she has to really kind of like grapple with these emotions, and because the space feels really empty, it feels as though she's much emptier without her husband. And then the flashbacks feel a lot more crowded. It feels like the public pressure is really weighing down on these characters, and that they actually have to appease a lot more people, and there's a lot more sort of actual events going on in their life, as opposed to emotions that they really have to process. So I really like the juxtaposition between those two things. I also think what's really great in this film is that in a lot of scenes, there's really a focus on one color. So it tends to be a red or a pink, and then sometimes it'll be like a green. And that happens less, obviously, when they're outside. There's a lot more natural things going on, but when Jackie Kennedy is wearing a costume, it tends to really stand out. And it also just makes Jackie Kennedy stand out, which this film is about Jackie, so it's really important that she stands out, even in scenes where she's with people who are really important and really famous. She's the one that stands out from both a production design standpoint and then also from a cinematography standpoint. So she's framed really well in this film. The film also has these long, sweeping, epic camera movements that there's not nearly as many cuts unless the scene really requires it. So most of these scenes have minimal cuts, long camera movements, and it really feels as though Jackie has a command of this space, and seeing her in the White House really shows the prestige of this character, and not only the image that the public might have of her, but the image that she has of herself, and the weight that she carries herself with. So I think that is a really nice way that the camera frames her, and is really important to telling the story. So I really like how she moves around in the space. I really like how the space is portrayed, and then how she's portrayed through these just really long, slow, methodical camera movements. And that's actually also how the editing works. It's really slow, it's very methodical, and really makes you sort of like try and process these emotions with Jackie Kennedy. And unlike the other biopics that I talked about, and just biopics in general, they're not trying to fit too many things into this movie, so we actually get to experience these things in a lot of times sort of like quote unquote in real time. It's not like there's a lot of cuts to transition things quickly. When we are in a scene, we're really in a scene, and we really get to experience it. So the editing takes the pacing really slowly. So this film does feel very slow, even though it's really only an hour 40. But I just think that's really a beautiful way to be telling this film, because it's much more about the emotions that Jackie Kennedy is feeling than it is the actual events. And then speaking on the actual events, because the film is so slow and methodical, obviously the one thing that everybody knows about that's going to probably be happening in this film is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so that's something that is sort of in the back of your mind when watching this film, and it's not something that the film gives to you right away, which I think is really tasteful, really respectful, and just a really great narrative device, because we kind of see what goes on early on in the film, mostly the aftermath of it. And because it's so slow and we really have already experienced it, later on in the film, when we do get to really kind of see the events as they transpired, is really, really jarring and really terrifying. And I actually think that was a really great way to show it, because not only was it just a really solid way of portraying it in the beginning of the film so you gain context that you may not have already had, that then later on in the film, because we know these characters, we know who they are, we really care about them now, and the film has just shown it in such a slow way, having that be so quick and scary really shows the impact of this event from a personal standpoint and from a cultural standpoint. The score here, too, is gorgeous. It's haunting. It's almost horror movie-esque. So in the way that I thought that the techno music of Radioactive might be a little bit uninspired, this is a very different score than you might be expecting. There's also kind of this running motif of Camelot, which is a musical that JFK was a big fan of, that plays kind of diegetically throughout the film. And so that might be kind of the style of music you might be expecting, these kind of like, because the camera movements also move in that way, these like long, sweeping, epic scores, but it's much more fragmented and kind of creepy, as this sort of ongoing tension throughout the film. So I love this score. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And then talking about the directing, I think the directing is one of the most fascinating aspects of this, because all the things that I've talked about obviously play into the directing, but this film is directed by Pablo Larraín, who is actually a Chilean director. So he's not American, which I think is a really interesting route to be going with this film, because this film is so steeped in American mythology. And actually, if you look at the directors of the past two movies too, they're also not directed by the culture that they're portraying. And I think that somewhat translates to how they're told, but they're mainly just trying to portray the culture in the way that they've done their research on. But all three of these films are made primarily for an American audience. And so the fact that this one is about the United States and about sort of like the folklore of the U.S. and the mythology of it, and it's not told from somebody who is sort of like somewhat indoctrinated with this since they were younger, and is told from almost an outsider's perspective, I think really shows the gravitas of a lot of what's going on here, the just like global impact, as well as focusing on the personal aspects of these characters, then translate to the much larger cultural, societal aspects of who these people represent. And so I like that it's kind of told from somebody who's not American, and it's not steeped in this already predetermined American mythology, and is told from somebody who might not have, who obviously probably knew about all of these things, but is doing it from a much more holistic standpoint. So I really, really love that choice that was being made here. he also does a great job in this film for cutting on emotions, for showing, not telling. This film really is all about the show and about what's lying underneath and a lot of the emotions that kind of seep through these historical events, these personal events. So this film is really gorgeous. It's really focused on the feeling as opposed to what's actually happening, and they kind of complement each other really nicely. It's not too broad in what it's trying to convey. It's focused on what it's trying to convey and much more about the emotions of it all. So I love this film. It is definitely my favorite biopic. It's actually in my top 20 movies of all time. So I'm going to give this film a solid 10 out of 10. It's phenomenal. If you really like biopics, I would highly recommend this. If you're fascinated about the subject material, or if you're just an overall film fan, this is one that I would definitely check out watching. So that's the last biopic I'll be talking about today. So next up, I'm going to be talking about some of the movie news from this past month, focusing primarily on Comic-Con, which I'm very excited to talk about. I'm excited to bring some of those things up. So right now, we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of Radioactive, Frida, and Jackie. This is a very biopic-centric episode, and I will now be talking about some of the movie news from July 2020. This one's going to be a little bit more focused on Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, because there's always movie news that comes out of that, and that actually just finished up this past weekend. So there's not nearly as much news from that as there would be in years past and hopefully in years future because of the fact that it was online, but there still was a little bit, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, as well as just some of the other movie news from this past month. So the first one is that we get a new trailer for New Mutants, which I think is absolutely hilarious. So New Mutants is, if you don't already know, the final X-Men installment from Fox after the acquisition by Disney. So this film is really fascinating because the trailer, it's fascinating, but I also just find it really funny. If there isn't a record for most times a film has been delayed, there should be, and this one would probably get it. It's a mystery that we're even going to get to see this movie if we ever do. Initially, this film was slated for 2017, 2018. I don't quite remember, but the trailer had come out. The trailer's been out for like 3 years now. And it was met with kind of mixed reviews as to what this film would mean. And people were primarily pretty excited for the fact that it was going to be horror inspired. So it's really about young mutants who are kind of in this like quote unquote insane asylum for mutants to harness their powers in some way. And so then it kind of becomes a horror film in the trailer. And I think based on the success of a lot of other R-rated superhero movies kind of subverting the genre in some way, people were kind of excited about that. And so because of that, Fox decided to do some reshoots and reshot a lot of this film because I guess that was mainly just the route that the trailer editors had gone in and maybe not was maybe not the final product of the film. So they did a lot of reshoots. So it was delayed 6 or 9 months or so. Then when it was delayed, when it was supposed to be coming out, was right when Disney was about to acquire Fox. And because that happened, Disney didn't have any plan, or Disney has sort of other plans for the X-Men they want to incorporate into their already Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so they didn't know if the New Mutants was something that they wanted to come out. So then it got delayed indefinitely. Didn't know when that was going to come out because of the fact that Disney now owned it. Then apparently Kevin Feige had seen the film, really, really liked it, so decided to release it not as a part of the MCU, but as the final kind of end of Fox X-Men. But because the whole Fox Disney thing took a while, it couldn't get released until Disney actually had full rights to those characters. And then COVID hit. So we're now it was supposed to get released like, I think, end of July, so maybe even next week, or it's supposed to get like released like middle of August, and now it's being pushed back indefinitely, but rumored to be put out in September. It was also rumored that it might be a Disney Plus original, which if it continues to get delayed and the way movie theaters are going, it probably will. I wouldn't be surprised if we see this one on Disney Plus because it's not actually part of the MCU. I also kind of had a little bit of a theory that it might end up being a part of the MCU because these actors are so young. You could easily incorporate it into the MCU as being the first X-Men installment. But I guess because Disney didn't do it, it doesn't really fit the mold. It might not be the one. It also is an R-rated film, so having the first MCU X-Men film be R-rated probably isn't the route that Kevin Feige and gang wants to go. So a new trailer was released. There was also the first 2 minutes of the film that was released. I didn't watch the first 2 minutes because I want to be surprised by this film. I'm kind of excited. There's so much like weird hype around it, so I'm very curious to what the film actually is. But that's New Mutants. We also got a trailer for Bill and Ted Face the Music, which is the third installment of the Bill and Ted series. It follows both Bill and Ted when they're much older, and it also follows their children, who are also kind of the same type of characters that they are. And based on the trailer, it seems as though they have to save the world by creating a new song with their children. So that seems to be the premise of Bill and Ted Face the Music. We got a new trailer for that. It also is supposedly getting released on September 1st, both on digital and in theaters if theaters are open by that point. So I'm somewhat excited for that film. I do like the first Bill and Ted quite a bit. Haven't actually seen the second Bill and Ted. But I'm curious to see what that film's going to be like. The trailer didn't grip me as much as I wanted it to. It didn't seem nearly as funny. It does have an actress that I really like from Atypical, but because she plays a character named Casey, so I kind of like her. But anyway, that's Bill and Ted Face the Music. That's really all the information, all the trailers that we got for films, because a lot of the stuff that happened out of Comic-Con was mostly surrounding TV shows. But those are the two big trailers that we got, which we had actually already had trailers for, but just kind of some added context to it. But moving on to just some of the other movie news out of Comic-Con, Colin Trevorrow announced that Jurassic World Dominion, which is the third installment of the Jurassic World series, is going to be much more focused on animatronics than it had been in the past, which I talked about this a little bit in one of my past episodes. I forget which one, but I was talking about puppets. And I'm really excited about this development because I didn't think any of the dinosaurs looked really bad in Jurassic World. They obviously look fine. They look great, really, with the modern CGI. But I really like the way animatronics move. I think it's just a much purer form for film, and so I really like that's a development they're trying to do. Some extra stuff. We are apparently getting some Rise of Skywalker tie-ins with books and comics that are hopefully going to clear up some of the feelings of the cloning thing with the Palpatines, and I don't know. I wasn't a huge fan of Rise of Skywalker. I can talk about that maybe in a later episode, and there tends to be a lot of stuff around Star Wars that happened kind of outside of the films. So that's not my favorite development from Comic-Con, but if that's something you're interested in, there are going to be some books and comics that then maybe clear up some of that information. We also got some new information about Justice League the Snyder Cut. So if anybody is a big DC fan or a superhero fan, you may have heard about all this. So Justice League had been re-edited and reshot in part by Joss Whedon after Snyder had to exit the project for personal reasons. And the product at hand was not something that a lot of fans really enjoyed. Not many people really liked. There tended to be, obviously, a mixed-matched vision. But a lot of fans and later on, a lot of the actors have been clamoring for the Snyder Cut. And after the sort of release of HBO Max, they had announced that they're going to release the Snyder Cut later next year, so early 2021. So we got a little bit more information about that. So supposedly this is going to have no shots from the Joss Whedon reshoots, so it's going to be completely different. And actually hearing more of the information about it, it seems like it's going to be a very different movie than I'm expecting. There may even be some added characters, a different villain. So it's going to be a super different movie. And not only that, it's going to be longer than, I think, 240 minutes, which might have been the other Justice League movie. It's going to be very long, but it's not known whether it's going to be an actual feature film or like a 6-part miniseries, which I would be much more interested in as a mini-series. But we got a little bit of a look of that. We got the first look at Superman's black suit, which, if you're a fan of the comics, you may know the black suit as a suit that he dons after kind of resurrecting from the dead in the Death of Superman comics. So this is something that happened in the original Justice League film, but he didn't put that suit on, was something that people may have wanted because he had died in Batman v Superman. Spoilers for that, I'm sorry, but it's been out for a while. It's also not that good of a film, so it doesn't really matter. But we got the first look at that with a scene of Henry Cavill and Jeremy Irons, so I am much more interested in that than I had been for the original Justice League film. The last kind of bit of information from Comic-Con is actually sort of some past information, which I just found somewhat fascinating. Robert Rodriguez gave a panel, and he talked about some of the pushback he had gotten from Spy Kids involving a Latinx family, and a lot of studios had said, why not just be an American family? That's what this film is about. And he said that it is an American family. It's my American family. That's who it's based around. And so I thought that was really fascinating insight around the film and how films get made. Also just the need, continued need for diversity in film that make films that much better, because I think Spy Kids is a great film. I really like that one. I might review that one later on too. So that's most of the information coming out of Comic-Con. So now let's move on to just some bigger information film-wise. So some of that information is AMC has changed their plan. So the last time I talked about this, AMC was planning on opening the 15th of July. We are now past the 15th of July, and that has not happened. That is mainly due to the fact that Tenet, the Christopher Nolan film, is the first film kind of slated to be released in theaters, and that had then been pushed back to early August. So AMC just didn't really have anything to open with. I'm also talking about AMC primarily because they tend to be the front runner of this movement as to when theaters are opening. A lot of other theaters are seemingly following suit. So they didn't have anything to release with, and because of that, they are now moving to opening mid to late August, because post that, Tenet has now been delayed indefinitely. It's not known when this film is getting released. It is speculated that it'll be mid to late August along with AMC, but it's sort of unknown now because of the fact that there are rising cases of COVID-19 throughout the entire United States. A lot of films are opening up, or slated to potentially begin opening up globally. I think Tenet is one of them now. But overall, we kind of don't know what's happening. Right now, it's really just mid to late August that AMC is probably opening. Hopefully they do, as long as it is safe to reopen. So that's something that is happening just for just films as a whole, the film industry. Some other film stuff is that the Avatar sequels have been delayed. So you heard that right. If you didn't already know, James Cameron's Avatar, the 2008 Best Picture nominee, global box office juggernaut, is apparently having 4 more sequels. James Cameron had announced this, I think, a couple years ago, back in 2016 maybe, that Avatar would be getting made into multiple sequels, in actually 5. So Avatar 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 now. And that had been originally slated to come out early next year, has now been pushed back to December of next year. But it's one that I don't even think they've started filming. So I don't know if that's ever going to happen. I think that would be... Honestly, I would be very surprised if we get to Avatar 5, but that's just me. Maybe it'll be great. I would love if it was great, but that's something that's happening, surprisingly. There's also a little bit of a minor internet campaign for Brie Larson to play Samus in a Metroid movie based on the video games. She is somebody that has transitioned into blockbuster filmmaking, obviously from sort of her beginning indie film days, playing Captain Marvel, and I think she would be an excellent choice for this film. Although I'm not a huge video game person, I think it would be definitely a fascinating character to play. Speaking of Brie Larson, a movie that she was in, Scott Pilgrim, had a digital read-through for charity with most of the cast members. Actually, not Brie Larson, though, sadly enough. It was a very entertaining read-through. I thought it was really fun to see the actors 10 years later, and it's a film that I love. It's also a stacked cast. Watching it now, it's crazy how many people are in that cast. So that was definitely very entertaining. I really enjoyed watching that. Peacock, the NBC Universal streaming service, is now live. It is free for viewers to watch most of NBC's library, also some films, potentially some original series coming out later on. There is a paid version subscription service that is also available to certain TV providers. But as far as I can tell, it seems as though the free version has ads, much like Hulu. But you can get a paid version that would not have any ads. The last two things I'll talk about is if you are a comic book fan, which you may be able to tell that I am, a very famous kind of indie, Image Comics is sort of the third tier of comics next to Marvel and DC, but one of their most famous characters, Spawn, who had a movie in the 90s, is apparently getting a new movie. This had been announced about a year ago by Todd McFarlane, the creator, and not much had been known about it for a very long time. He then announced recently that they are moving full steam ahead with some big surprises and that they are very, very close to making some announcements for that film. So that's something that I'm definitely curious to see. It will probably be an R-rated superhero film because that's sort of the route that the comics take, but I'm curious to see how that goes. And then the final one, this somewhat coincides with AMC delay, but Mulan has decided to delay indefinitely, probably going along with the reopening of AMC, which is currently obviously closed. And so whenever that comes back or announces to come back, you can probably expect to see an announcement as to when Mulan is coming back, because they are mainly focused on the American and Chinese box offices for that film. So that's a lot of the movie news from this past month. If you have any extra stuff that I might have missed, feel free to tweet it at us, GSMC_movies. I would love to hear some of the stuff that you might know about that I might have missed, some of your opinions on the episode at large, and maybe some of your opinions on the stuff that happened in Comic-Con. I'd love to hear that. We really love to hear from you guys. Shub, Elizabeth, and I are always checking the Twitter, always checking the reviews. So we really like hearing from you guys. Thank you guys so much for listening to this show. It's been really a great joy for me to be doing this twice a week. I really love talking about movies. I really hope you liked this episode. It was a really fun episode to do. And I'm really excited for some of the next episodes that I have just recently planned. So stay tuned for that. And as always, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write us a nice review, because that really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.